Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet. He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
It's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a town called Luton, which is a beautiful, picturesque little town, you might know it, just north of London. And I always feel like I have to apologise for where I was brought up. And I think it's because Luton is one of those places which, at first glance, appears to have very few redeeming features. But let me tell you, when you scratch beneath the surface, you find out that it has none at all, actually. And my parents had been missionaries in China, and they came back before we were born, and they raised us there. And so faith and church were a part of my life from the very earliest stages. But then I went to my local state school, and it's what I guess you might call a failing school, because it failed, and it's actually been bulldozed now. There's no school there. And when I arrived there, out of 800 people, I quite quickly worked out that I was one of only 2 or 3 who had any kind of faith or went to church. And it really struck me. And I suddenly realized that these things I've been brought up with other people didn't appear to have them in their lives. And it really made me think, well, maybe this stuff isn't true. Maybe you don't have to believe these things that my parents have taught me to believe. And at the same time, all the people my age in the church just stopped coming. I tried not to take it too personally, but they just stopped coming to church. And I was kind of left there thinking, and forced to think, at that age, is this really true? And it wasn't an option for me just to bury my head in the sand and to hope that it was true, pretend it was true, or to, take some kind of blind leap of faith. I needed some evidence. For me personally, evidence has always been really important. After growing up in Luton, I went to read law at Oxford, and I actually ended up studying and working as a lawyer for over 10 years. I was a criminal barrister in London, defending people and prosecuting people accused of crimes. And the question, every case I worked on, the key question was, what is the evidence? Every day, for all those years, every day I'd be saying, what's the evidence? How does the case stack up? What actually happened? What's the evidence about the events? And when it comes to Jesus, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what is the evidence? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. As you know, science answers the questions how and when, but it doesn't answer the questions who and why. I've got a little visual aid. This is a cake. The observant of among you wouldn't have needed me to tell you that, but that's a cake. And if I took this cake to the top cake scientists in the world, cakeologists, I think they're called, and I said to them, tell me as much as you can about this cake, they'd be able to tell me, I think, how it was made. They'd be able to tell me what it's made of. They'd probably be able to tell me when it was made, but they wouldn't be able to tell me who made it or why it was made. Only the maker can reveal that, actually. Now, I actually made this cake. I'm quite excited about it. It's not a great cake, but I made it. And partly as a visual aid, but partly for my wonderful small group over there. It's a great cake. Science is so important, though. Science is so important. It reveals how things happen and when they happen, but it doesn't tell us who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian. You can't prove that there isn't a God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to take a look at what is called historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. Lawyers are very interested in historical evidence. Every time a jury tries a case, looks at a case, they're looking at historical evidence. And juries, every time they come back and they say guilty or not guilty, or they come back with a verdict, they're taking a step of faith based on historical evidence. And I myself could not be a Christian if it needed me to take a blind jump of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of just taking a step of faith based on the historical evidence of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, hang on a second. I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? And that's a really good question. And it might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is this. If I want to know you, I can find out a certain amount about you by looking at you, watching you. But I can only really know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that he's done that sort of in a way that you might expect, in a way that makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as human beings, the logical way to do that is to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus in particular that convinces me that this world has a creator, and that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what's the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is that we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. And no serious secular historian would dispute that. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. The Jewish first century historian Flavius Josephus talks about him. He says this: "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but more importantly, there's evidence inside the New Testament. Well, sometimes people say, well, the New Testament was written a really long time ago. How can we be sure that what they wrote hasn't changed over the years? And the answer is that we do know very accurately what the original writers wrote through something called textual criticism. And the way it works is that the more manuscripts you have, and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure you can be about the original. So here's some examples. We're just going to look. For example, Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900, and there's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. But no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap. We have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, a 900-year gap and 20 copies. When it comes to the New Testament, though, it is unique among ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and their closeness in time to the original. The New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 other manuscripts. That's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, who's an expert in these things, said that in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone among ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but who is he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of an education, of having a job, of being tempted, of being bereaved, of suffering, of torture, and the experience of death. Many today would say, well, okay, he was a human being, but he was only a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there's two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was anything other than a human being, a great religious teacher, that's pretty much the end of the argument. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. And it's true, he didn't walk around with a t-shirt saying, I am God. I looked actually on Google, and you can actually buy a t-shirt saying, I am God, just in case any of you might be interested in that particular fashion choice. I don't recommend it. But he didn't walk around with that sort of t-shirt. But I think if you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. And so that's the first part of the argument. And secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support that? So what did he say about himself? Well, first of all, the teaching of Jesus was centered on himself. Most great religious teachers point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, who was supremely humble, in pointing people to God, pointed them to himself. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. I don't know whether you've experienced that sense, that though you've got lots of things in your life that should satisfy, they're good things, things that you enjoy, there's a sense that something's missing. You sense a spiritual hunger. And Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And that's what I found. And then there's the bad stuff, the habits that I found very addictive. Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, if Jesus sets you free, you will be free indeed. And that's also my experience, that Jesus set me free from all sorts of things, like a bad temper. And some of those things were very quick, some of those things have taken a bit longer. And then there's stuff like worry, anxiety, fear, guilt. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You'll find peace. Jesus said, if you receive me, you'll receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. There was a 5-year-old girl, and she was doing she was drawing a picture, and her mother said to her, oh, what are you doing? And the girl said, oh, I'm actually drawing a picture of God. So the mother said, don't be silly, you can't draw a picture of God. No one knows what God looks like. The girl said, well, they will do when I'm finished. And Jesus said, if you want to know what good looks like, look at me. So firstly, Jesus' teaching was centered on himself. But then secondly, there's his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. Jesus went up to people he had never met before in his life and said, your sins are forgiven. And the people around him, the lawyers, were like, what do you think you're doing? You can't forgive people who sin against others. That's something only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And we don't have time to look at all of them, but I just want to look at one. If somebody says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only have time to show them one verse, show them this. The background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God is blasphemy, and it's punishable by death. The religious leaders considered it was punishable by death, by stoning. And Jesus said this in John 10:30, I and the Father are one. And again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? And they replied, we're not stoning you for any of these, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. And those who were around him, who heard him, those who opposed him, said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what Jesus was claiming. They said he was claiming to be God, and they said he deserved to die for it. So that's the first part of the argument. What did Jesus say about himself? Now, obviously, that's a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. So how do we test such claims? Well, Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, God made flesh, and it seems that there's three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and he knew it wasn't true. In which case, he's a fraudster, an imposter, and an evil one at that. The second possibility is that it wasn't true, but he genuinely thought it was true. He didn't realize it, that it wasn't true. And we call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So what evidence? That's what he said, but what evidence is there to support what Jesus claimed? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Treat others in the way that you would have them treat you. And then this revolutionary teaching, the first person to say it, love your enemies. Just think, Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of really our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were founded on the teaching of Jesus. Think about this, we've advanced in almost every field. In science, just think about the technological advancements, even of the last 10 years. But no one in 2,000 years has ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the sort of words you might expect God to speak. And then his life, the things that he did, he must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, oh, Christianity's boring, but it wouldn't have been boring to be around Jesus. I just want you to think for a second. You're facing a serious moral dilemma. You can phone a friend. Of your group of friends, who's your go-to person that you'd phone? Who do you know is sensible, wise, will give you good advice? You could pick up the phone, you get sense out of them. Just picture that person in your mind. And then I want you to imagine it's a Friday night and you've got something huge to celebrate. And you need to have a great party, a great night out. Who's the person? Picture the person in your friendship group you'd phone. There's someone you'd phone. I'm guessing for most of us, they're not the same people. If that's just me, they're very different people in my mind. I would never get them mixed up. It would be very unpleasant. But what's fascinating about Jesus is that he not only gave the world the greatest moral teaching it's ever seen or heard, but you might remember the story. He goes to a party and the wine runs out. So he says, you see those stone jars over there? Fill them with 20 or 30 gallons of bath water each and then pour them out. And out pours amazing wine, the best wine of the night. Jesus was the one who kept the party going. I mean, that might be a surprise to you to hear that. But not just his miracles, his love for the loveless, for people who society had written off, for outcasts. The way he set people free and still sets people free today. That's one of the things I most love about Jesus, the way he sets people free from all sorts of things. And of course, I suppose, ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this, Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends, those who knew him the best, said, this guy's without sin. But the real test of character is what we're like when we're really under pressure. And when he was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were even born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies, 29 of them in a single day, written by different voices over hundreds of years. And some people might say, well, okay, Jesus read the Old Testament, and he did read the Old Testament. So maybe he thought, I'll just go around and fulfill these prophecies. But it doesn't work, not only because of the sheer number of them, but because there were many things he simply had no control over. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, about the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. Imagine Jesus kind of reading through the Old Testament. Oh, I was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. You're too late. But he was born in Bethlehem. And it was something he had absolutely no control over. And then, and by far the most important, his conquest of death, the physical resurrection of Jesus from the dead, is the cornerstone of Christianity. It's so relevant to every one of us here. Every one of us is going to die. I feel a bit awkward bringing that up. It's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? 1 in 1 of us in this room is going to die. And we're really uncomfortable about it. I don't know if you've noticed when someone famous or a celebrity or someone dies, all the media reports on it. And for a second you report on the fact of death. But even if it's quite tragic, quite quickly we're on to talking about what an amazing person they are, what an amazing life they lived. It's almost as if we can't bear to sit with death for more than a moment. It's too terrifying. It's funny, we don't like to talk about it. The Victorians didn't talk about sex, but they loved to talk about death. We talk a lot about sex, but we don't like to talk about death. I even heard about a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a more politically correct way of talking about it. They talk about negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, we die. And you go to a funeral, and there's a coffin, and you see it being lowered into the ground, and it looks so final. It looks like the end. And it is the end, unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and he was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means that every one of us has the opportunity of eternal life. That's the basis for hope at every funeral. But is it true? Is it true? I mean, that's what matters. Just because it's great to believe doesn't make it true. So what's the evidence? I hadn't realized how much evidence there is for the physical resurrection of Jesus. First of all, no one has ever satisfactorily explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. Some people say, oh, well, the authorities must have taken the body. But that's not very likely, because if they had the body, all they had to do when people were running around saying, Jesus is risen, he's risen from the dead, is say, no, he's not, he's here. And that would have been quite an easy solution. Then people said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But leaving aside the fact that the tomb was guarded, it's psychologically improbable. We have a depressed, disillusioned group of people. And then look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something that they would have known if they'd taken the body was false? And other people say, well, maybe some robbers came and stole the body. And that's the least likely of all, because, I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb wasn't empty. Jesus' body was absent. But when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing which robbers would want to take. And they had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterfly emerges. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded and placed in a separate place. And when the disciples saw that, they believed. The second piece of evidence, not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, but he was present with his disciples. He was seen by many different people on many different occasions. Sometimes people say, well, isn't that hallucination? And yeah, people do hallucinate. Kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people, people who have taken quite a lot of drugs. But among Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, who was the ultimate skeptic. You had a group of tough, gritty fishermen. You had Matthew, who was a tax collector. I mean, tax collectors don't hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even two people could have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third piece of evidence is the immediate impact. Here were a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that changed them so much that after 3 days, after Jesus' death, they were going around telling everybody, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon, this extraordinary phenomenon, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's extraordinary because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there is this explosion in 300 years, right across the whole known world. It's a story of peaceful revolution with no parallel, really, in the history of the world. And it's a story which continues today. Every day, tens of thousands of people are placing their trust in Jesus. Today, there's 2,300,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. And we have Christian experience through the ages, countless millions of people who've experienced the risen Jesus. And it's people from every continent, every nationality, every ethnicity, every economic, social, and intellectual background. People from all walks of life, they unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. And so when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, the fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, it seems unbelievable and illogical to say that he was evil or that he was deluded. And so I'm left with the only other option. When I look at those things, they give the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there's all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. When I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge went from my head to my heart. So that I can tell you, for the last 15 or so years, I have experienced a friendship with Jesus. I've had my ups and downs. I've messed up more times than I care to imagine. I am far from perfect. But I have experienced what Jesus promised. Jesus said, I've come so you might have life, and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed to be.